In the year 1945, the war in Europe had finally reached its bitter end. Cities lay in ruins. Silence replaced the thunder of artillery, and the once proud armies of Hitler's Reich had been broken, scattered, and captured. Among those who found themselves prisoners were not only men in uniform, but women, nurses, auxiliaries, clerks, and support staff of the German war machine. Many of them had lived through years of propaganda warning that capture meant humiliation, cruelty, or worse. They expected vengeance. They braced for the harsh justice of enemies who had suffered under German occupation, who had seen their towns burned, their families torn apart, and their lives shattered. But what awaited them was not what they had imagined. Instead of beatings, there were blankets. Instead of starvation, there was warm bread, steaming soup, and hot coffee. Instead of being treated as hated enemies, they were seen as human beings, exhausted, frightened, and broken by the war they had once believed their nation could win. For women who had been told their captors would show no mercy, this unexpected compassion struck deeper than any punishment. In the quiet of the camps, the guns of war replaced by the rattle of mess tins, something profoundly human unfolded. The defeat of hatred by a simple act of mercy. They had prepared for cruelty. When the barbed wire fences closed around them, their eyes searched for the blows, the hunger, the humiliation they had been warned about. Instead, they were handed woolen blankets and directed to clean quarters, warmer than the rubble-filled ruins they had left behind. The guards did not scream, nor strike them. They simply pointed them toward rest. This small gesture was the first crack in the wall of fear that surrounded them. The women had walked for hours under the watchful gaze of armed soldiers, their boots dragging through mud and gravel. Their uniforms ragged, their hair unkempt, their spirits hollow. They whispered to one another in broken voices, asking what awaited them, asking if this march would end at a firing squad wall or in some cold cell where starvation and humiliation would be their companions. The propaganda they had been fed throughout the war echoed in their thoughts like a curse. Words that had warned of enemy brutality, that had painted their captors as monsters thirsting for revenge. It was not just fear of the unknown. It was fear of the images they had carried for years, images of torture, of degradation, of being stripped of dignity and identity. Each step forward was heavy, not with exhaustion alone, but with dread. The camp came into view slowly, emerging through the mist like some grim fortress. A barbed wire fence stretched in all directions, its sharp edges catching the dull light of a winter sky. Guard towers loomed above, silhouettes of armed men inside scanning every movement. The women drew closer, their hearts tightening, their steps faltering. Here it was, the place of their undoing, the place where they would cease to be anything more than prisoners. Some clutched rosaries hidden in their pockets, others whispered silent prayers, and many simply stared forward with vacant eyes, resigned to the cruelty they expected would come. The gates opened with a metallic groan, and the group was ushered in with curt gestures. Not a word of welcome, not a smile, not even a barked insult, only silence, which in its own way was more unnerving. Inside the perimeter, they braced for what would come next. Would the guards jeer at them? Would they be stripped, paraded, or thrown into filthy cells? But nothing happened. Instead, a line of soldiers stepped forward, not to beat them, but to distribute something. For a moment, the women shrank back, thinking these objects might be weapons or tools of punishment. Then they saw what was being handed out, thick, coarse woolen blankets folded neatly, the kind used to ward off the biting chill of the night. The shock was palpable. These women, who had steeled themselves for cruelty, now stood frozen, unsure whether to accept what was offered. It seemed impossible. Blankets were comfort, warmth, even safety, and none of those things had any place in the world of a prisoner. One by one, they reached out tentative hands. Some took the blankets and clutched them tightly to their chests, as though fearing they might be snatched away in cruel mockery. Others hesitated, eyes darting between the guards and their fellow prisoners, searching for some hidden trick. But there was no trick. The soldiers moved on methodically, offering the same to each, their faces impassive but not hostile. No ridicule, no sneering words of conquest, only the silent gesture of giving. For the women, the blankets were more than fabric. They were a symbol, a small proof that their captors did not see them as beasts to be broken, but as human beings worthy of a shred of dignity. As the women clutched their new possessions, they were directed toward a row of barracks. The structures were simple, wooden, plain, with smoke rising faintly from chimneys. Compared to the ruins of bombed cities they had left behind, these barracks seemed almost like lodges of safety. Inside, the air was warmer than expected. The scent of burning wood filled their lungs, and the dim glow of lanterns cast a gentle light on wooden bunks lined in order. It was no luxury, far from it, but to those who had expected nothing but darkness and hunger, it was a revelation. They stood in the doorways, stunned, unwilling to believe that they were being offered shelter instead of punishment. Some of them broke then and there. A few women, their nerves stretched thin for too long, sank to the floor, clutching their blankets and weeping silently. Their tears were not only of relief, but of shame, confusion, and exhaustion. For years, they had been told their enemies would exact vengeance, that women like them would be treated with cruelty beyond imagination. And yet here they were, standing in barracks warmed by fire, holding blankets against their shoulders. It was as though the world had turned upside down, as though everything they had believed about how this war would end was a lie. The silence in the room was broken only by the sound of muffled sobs and the occasional crack of firewood. The guards did not interfere. They gave directions with gestures, pointing the women toward their bunks, indicating where they could rest, where they could place their few belongings. There were no shouted orders, no blows to the back, no forced humiliations. It was a strange stillness, one that disarmed the women more than any act of violence could have. Fear had prepared them for brutality, but it had not prepared them for kindness. And in that dissonance, in that clash between expectation and reality, their spirits faltered, stripped bare not by cruelty, but by mercy. The night came quickly. Wrapped in the blankets, many of the women lay awake, staring into the darkness above them. They listened to the faint sounds of footsteps outside, the crackle of fire and the occasional murmur of guards exchanging quiet words. But there were no screams, no whips, no terror. Only silence and warmth. They pulled the wool closer to their bodies, feeling a comfort they had not known in months, perhaps years. For some, the relief was so profound that sleep came almost immediately, carrying them into dreams untouched by war for the first time since their world had collapsed. For others, the weight of the moment was too much, and they lay awake, trying to reconcile what they had been told with what they were experiencing. In that small, unexpected mercy, an unspoken truth revealed itself. Even in war, even in defeat, there could be humanity. And for these women, that humanity came not in the form of speeches or promises, but in something simple and profound: a warm blanket, a quiet barracks, and the chance to rest without fear. Hunger had gnawed at them for days, some for weeks. They expected rations of crusts and bitter coffee, if anything at all. But when steaming pots appeared, filled with broth, bread, and potatoes, they stared in silence. The first taste of real food brought tears, breaking through the rigid pride they had carried into captivity. For the first time in months, they were fed not as soldiers, but as people. The hunger had begun long before capture. In the final weeks of the war, as cities burned and the Reich crumbled, food had become a luxury few could find. Bombed railroads cut supply lines, convoys were scattered, and store shelves stood bare. Civilians scavenged in ruins for scraps, soldiers chewed on meager rations, and those assigned to rear positions like clerks, nurses, and auxiliaries often went without entirely. These women, captured after days of retreat and chaos, carried that hunger in their eyes. It hollowed their cheeks, weakened their steps, and clouded their thoughts. They had not expected kindness in captivity, but they had at least expected food to keep them alive for whatever punishment awaited. And yet even that expectation was shadowed by fear. Rumors had told them that prisoners would be left to starve, given just enough to suffer, but never enough to recover. Starvation, they believed, was to be their true sentence. When the order came to line up, their eyes followed the movements of guards, leading them toward a large building at the heart of the camp. The air smelled of smoke, wood, and something else, something almost forgotten, cooking. It was faint at first, carried on the wind like a distant memory, but as they drew closer, the scent grew stronger. Steam lifted in curls from behind open windows, mingling with the smell of firewood and faint spices. The women slowed their steps, their senses sharpening, their bodies instinctively responding to the aroma of food. Could it be real? Could their captors truly be preparing a meal for them? Suspicion twisted with hope, and many lowered their eyes, afraid to trust what their noses told them. Inside the mess hall, long wooden tables stretched from one end to the other. Metal pots rested at the far side, tended by soldiers in aprons who stirred slowly with long ladles. The women shuffled forward hesitantly, their hands gripping tin mess kits or whatever containers they had been given. The hall echoed with the clatter of utensils, the hiss of steam, and the occasional bark of orders between kitchen staff. For the prisoners it was a surreal scene. The very men they had feared would lash them or starve them were instead serving them food, ladling soup into their containers with the same mechanical rhythm one might serve their own comrades. The soup was simple. Thin broth with potatoes, carrots and chunks of bread floating in it, but to the starving women it was nothing less than a feast. They looked down at the rising steam, their breath catching as if it might vanish before they could taste it. Some could not wait. They lifted the containers to their lips and sipped while still standing in line. The heat burned their tongues, but they didn't care. Tears welled in their eyes, blurring the sight of the soldiers before them. A silence filled the hall, broken only by the scrape of spoons and the muffled sobs of those who could no longer hold back the flood of emotion. At the tables, the women ate hungrily, some too fast, some pausing only to hold their bowls close and inhale the warmth. For weeks they had survived on scraps of blackened bread, on weeds plucked from ruined fields, on nothing at all. Now every spoonful seemed to restore life to their bodies, every bite a reminder that they were still human. Pride, once drilled into them by uniforms and slogans, fell away as they bowed over their bowls, trembling with gratitude. Their captors, standing nearby, watched quietly but said little. For the guards, this was not an act of generosity for its own sake. It was procedure, order, discipline. But for the women it was salvation. Some prisoners whispered to each other between bites, their words filled with disbelief. How could this be? Why would their enemies feed them when they had expected torment? Others could not speak at all, their voices caught in their throats by the swell of relief. For many, the moment broke them completely. Tears fell freely into the broth, mingling with the steam, and they did not bother to wipe them away. Hunger had hardened them, made them bitter, but food, real food, softened them once again. It reminded them of kitchens back home, of mothers and families now scattered or gone, of a life that war had stolen. In that mess hall, as spoons clattered and bowls emptied, war felt far away, even if only for an hour. The guards moved between tables, watching carefully, but without cruelty. Some adjusted stoves, others refilled pots, while a few even poured water into tin cups for the women. The prisoners glanced at them, confused by their calmness. These were not monsters or avengers, but men performing their duties with quiet efficiency. That, more than anything, unsettled the women. They had prepared their souls for hatred, but not for indifference that leaned toward humanity. As the meal ended, silence settled once more. The women lingered over empty bowls, reluctant to part with them, reluctant to return to the hunger that had stalked them for so long. When the soldiers began to clear the tables, the prisoners slowly rose, clutching their blankets tighter and holding on to the warmth that still filled their bellies. The memory of that meal would not leave them soon. For many, it was not just food. It was proof that the world they had been taught to fear was not the one they lived in now. That night, lying on their bunks with the taste of broth still lingering on their tongues, many of the women cried themselves to sleep, not from sorrow, but from the crushing weight of relief. Hunger, the great tormentor, had been silenced. For the first time in months, their stomachs were not empty, their bodies not racked with pain. They were prisoners, yes, but prisoners who had been fed like people, not animals. It was a small mercy, but in their state, it was everything. In the stillness, the truth became undeniable. Mercy does not always arrive in great declarations or sweeping gestures. Sometimes it comes quietly, in a wooden bowl of soup, in the rough crust of bread, in the kindness of being allowed to eat without fear. And in that simplicity, the humanity of their captors revealed itself, cutting deeper than any weapon could. Even the sound of silence was a mercy. No air raid sirens, no bombs, no shouted orders in the night. Only the quiet of a camp where routines were simple: eat, rest, recover. The women, once indoctrinated with visions of cruelty, found themselves sitting in the sun, talking softly, even daring to laugh again. Their fear began to lift, replaced by something almost forgotten: peace. The silence was the first thing that struck them. It was not the oppressive silence of a battlefield after slaughter, nor the eerie quiet of a ruined city where life had fled. This was a gentler silence, broken only by the rustle of trees beyond the fence, the murmur of voices, the creak of boots on gravel. For years they had lived in a world of noise. The shriek of air raid sirens, the pounding of artillery, the droning of aircraft, the sharp crack of rifles, the endless barks of orders. Noise had been their constant companion, a reminder that death lurked around every corner. Now in captivity, stripped of power and freedom, they found something war itself had stolen from them: quiet. At first, they did not trust it. The absence of violence felt unnatural, a trick waiting to collapse at any moment. When the guards called them for morning roll, the women braced for shouting, for blows. Yet the voices they heard were calm, clipped but not cruel. When they were dismissed back to the barracks or to the yard, there were no dogs lunging, no clubs raised, no insults hurled. The silence of routine unnerved them. But slowly, almost reluctantly, they began to surrender to it. They sat together on benches or leaned against barrack walls, speaking in hushed tones, letting the sun warm their tired faces. For the first time in months, perhaps years, they were not forced to move, to flee, to obey some frenzied order barked from above. Day by day, that silence seeped deeper into them. It was not freedom, no. Barbed wire still framed every view, towers still loomed with watchful eyes. But it was a kind of reprieve. They began to notice things they had long forgotten to notice. The way the wind moved gently through the trees outside the fence. The way dust floated in golden beams of sunlight through a crack in the barracks wall, the distant hum of insects in the grass. These small details had once been drowned out by the chaos of war, but now they returned, stitching together something fragile within the women, a sense that life could exist without constant terror. Conversations slowly bloomed in this fragile peace. At first, they were whispers exchanged between bunks, tentative and cautious. Then, as the days passed and no punishment fell upon them, the voices grew louder, steadier, carrying laughter, sighs, and the lilt of memory. They spoke of home, of mothers and fathers, of children left behind, of the familiar smells of kitchens and fields. Some remembered small joys, like the sound of church bells on Sundays, or the warmth of bread fresh from the oven. Others spoke of lost loves, of brothers and husbands who would never return, their words heavy with grief. But still, the talking was healing, for it was free of command, free of fear. In the act of speaking softly to one another, they began to reclaim what the war had stripped from them, their humanity. In the evenings, after meals, they would gather near the fence where the setting sun cast long shadows across the camp. There, in small clusters, they shared whispers and sometimes dared to laugh. The sound startled even themselves. Laughter had been an outlawed luxury under hunger and terror. The first time it bubbled up, nervous eyes darted to the guards, expecting punishment. But none came. The guards barely glanced, indifferent to the sound. And so the women laughed again, shy at first, then freer, rediscovering the forgotten release of joy. It was not the laughter of celebration, but the laughter of survivors, fragile and trembling, yet deeply human. The silence also carried a strange weight of reflection. With the noise of war stripped away, the women were left alone with their thoughts. At night, as they lay on their bunks wrapped in coarse blankets, many stared at the wooden ceilings and let the memories come. Some thought of the destruction wrought by the regime they had served, and guilt pressed heavily upon them. Others tried to block those thoughts, clinging instead to hopes that their families might still be alive. The silence was not always comfortable. It could be haunting, forcing them to confront things they had buried under duty and propaganda. Yet even then, it was better than the ceaseless roar of war. It gave them room to think, to breathe, to simply exist. Children had often filled their memories with noise, laughter, crying, the patter of feet across wooden floors. Now, when the silence of the camp grew heavy, some of the women whispered lullabies to themselves, soft fragments of songs they had once sung to younger siblings or children of their own. The tunes floated gently through the barracks, blending with the quiet night. Sometimes others joined in, their voices weak but steady, until a low chorus of memory filled the air. It was in these moments that the silence of captivity became something else entirely, a fragile sanctuary where the human spirit whispered that it was not yet broken. Perhaps most remarkable was how quickly their bodies began to respond. Rest, food, and the absence of terror gave them strength. Their cheeks grew less hollow, their steps firmer, their eyes less haunted. They began to sit taller, to walk with something resembling confidence. The silence of the camp did not only soothe their minds, it allowed their bodies to heal. When the sun was out, they would stand close to the fences, stretching their hands toward its warmth, eyes closed as if soaking in life itself. When rain fell, they would stand under the barrack awnings, listening to the gentle patter against the roof, grateful for the simple, unthreatening rhythm of nature's song. The guards, observing from their towers and posts, said little. They let the women find their own way through the days, as long as rules were kept. To some of the prisoners, that silence was more merciful than words could ever be. There was no gloating, no reminders of defeat, no verbal lashings meant to strip away dignity. Only silence and the space to recover. For women who had braced themselves for endless torment, that quiet was liberation in its own strange way. It was not the freedom of open roads or homecomings, but the freedom from fear, from noise, from the chaos that had defined their lives for so long. And in that silence, for the first time in years, they could breathe deeply, close their eyes and imagine a world beyond the barbed wire where peace might not just be a fleeting dream. For the guards, it was not about sympathy for the enemy, but about a principle that even in war's aftermath, humanity must not die. These women had once been part of a machine that spread suffering. Yet here, behind the wire, they were simply human beings who had survived. Warm blankets, hot meals, and a chance at dignity. These became symbols not of weakness, but of moral strength. The American guards had seen enough of war to know its ugliness. Many of them had marched through devastated villages, had pulled bodies from rubble, had seen the scars left on civilians who had lived under German occupation. Hatred would have been easy. Revenge would have been simple. Yet when the prisoners arrived, frightened, exhausted, hollow-eyed women, it became clear that vengeance would achieve nothing. The men who stood watch over the camp carried their own traumas, but they carried something else as well. Discipline, duty, and a belief that victory meant more than conquest. It meant upholding a standard that set them apart from the brutality they had fought against. To mistreat these women would have been to lower themselves into the same pit of cruelty the world had just struggled to escape. So the guards chose another path, one forged not out of kindness for its own sake, but out of principle. They offered blankets because no prisoner should shiver needlessly. They offered meals because hunger was not a punishment, but a misery of war that should not be prolonged. They offered dignity because stripping it away would serve nothing but cruelty. These decisions may have seemed small in the moment, but to the women on the other side of the wire, they were transformative. The sight of an American soldier draping a blanket over the shoulders of a shivering prisoner was not dramatic in the way that battles were dramatic. There was no roar of guns, no banners waving in the wind. Yet in that small act there was a kind of quiet heroism. It was the heroism of refusing to become cruel, of standing firm in the belief that moral strength was measured not by how one treated allies, but by how one treated the defeated. The soldier did not know the woman's name, nor her past, nor the choices that had led her there. To him, in that moment, she was simply cold, and he had the means to ease that cold. That was enough. The camp kitchen, too, became a symbol of this principle. Every day, pots were stirred, bread was baked or delivered, and bowls were filled. The routine was not glamorous, and many soldiers grumbled at the monotony of it. But behind that monotony was something greater, proof that the victors of this war did not descend into the shadows of cruelty. Instead, they held to a belief that order and humanity must survive, even in the ruins of conflict. When prisoners sat down to eat, they did not just receive calories. They received the unspoken assurance that their captors would not treat them as animals. This, perhaps more than anything else, shattered the terror that had bound the women when they first entered the camp. The women themselves wrestled with confusion. How could their enemies, painted for years as brutal and merciless, now show such restraint? They had been prepared to hate their captors, to despise them, to suffer under them. But instead, they found themselves quietly respecting them, even if they could not admit it aloud. The blankets were warm, the food nourishing, the silence bearable, and the treatment, even with strict discipline, was never designed to humiliate. The contradiction gnawed at them, making them question the lies they had believed, the propaganda they had been fed. Some whispered among themselves that perhaps this was a strategy, that perhaps kindness was a weapon, but deep down they knew the truth. It was not strategy. It was a moral choice. For the guards, these acts were not born of softness, but of strength. To treat a defeated enemy with dignity required more resolve than cruelty ever could. Cruelty was easy. Rage fueled it. Grief justified it. But restraint, discipline, and humanity, those required conviction. Each meal served, each blanket offered, each moment of calm discipline was a statement that the war was over, and that the victors would not abandon the humanity they had fought to protect. In the evenings, when the sun sank low and shadows stretched long across the camp, the guards often walked their patrol routes slowly. They passed the barracks where voices murmured softly within, where the prisoners gathered in small circles under the watchful gaze of the towers. They saw the women sitting in silence, sometimes with their heads bowed in exhaustion, sometimes whispering to one another as if rediscovering the lost language of ordinary life. The guards did not intrude. Their presence was reminder enough of the boundaries, but within those boundaries they allowed space for dignity. To let an enemy laugh again, to let them sit in the sun, to let them feel like human beings, this too was a victory. The symbolism of these simple mercies extended beyond the camp walls. In a world scarred by brutality, they stood as proof that not all hearts had been consumed by hatred. Reports spread quietly, stories of prisoners treated with decency even in defeat. These stories mattered, for they showed that the victors carried not only weapons of war, but also the discipline of peace. The women, when they were eventually released or transferred, carried these memories with them. Some would remember them with shame, others with gratitude, but none would forget. And in remembering, they would carry proof that their enemies had not descended to the depths their own leaders had so often embraced. At its core, this treatment was not about individuals, but about a moral vision. The war had been fought not just to defeat armies, but to defend the idea that cruelty could not be allowed to rule the world unchecked. The guards, perhaps without even realizing the weight of their actions, embodied that vision. By refusing to strip dignity from their captives, they declared to history that the strength of a nation was measured not only by the battles it won, but by the mercy it chose to show when victory was secured. And so, in the quiet routines of a prison camp, blankets, meals, and dignity became symbols of something greater than survival. They became symbols of humanity's refusal to surrender to hatred, of the resilience of moral strength even after years of bloodshed. The women who had once expected cruelty would forever remember the night they slept warmly, the meal that filled their bellies, the silence that soothed their minds. And the guards, though they may never have seen themselves as anything more than ordinary men doing their duty, had unknowingly written a chapter of history that spoke louder than violence ever could, that even in the aftermath of war, mercy mattered.